This is a session where we're going to get the perspectives of federal agencies who are the government funders of the research. That's the part of stakeholder community that they're in. And so we have two agencies represented, the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. And the format of this panel will be a little bit different. We'll have each of them give about a half-hour overview of what their thoughts are in this, and then we'll have a discussion and dialogue. So let me begin by introducing first Dr. Tabak. He's a Principal Deputy Director of the National Institutes of Health and Deputy Ethics Counselor of the agency. He was previously an acting principal director of NIH, and for 10 years before that was a director of the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research. He's had numerous leadership positions throughout NIH, including leading trans NIH activities, the NIH roadmap on team science. I'll just list a couple, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act implementation, so some significant crossing the nation projects. He's co-chaired working groups to the advisory committee of the director of NIH and is currently chairing both the Next Gen Researchers Initiative and High Risk, High Reward Research Working Group. So he has a broad background in all aspects of the agency, and I look forward to his perspective.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. So a couple of things. I have good news and bad news. Let me start with the bad news. So when you get to the penultimate panel of a meeting like this, everybody has said everything you're going to say. So thank you, everybody who preceded me. And the good news is it means we're going to have a lot more time for discussion. So there you go. People often ask what the principal deputy director of NIH does. It's very simple. I do everything Francis can't do or doesn't want to do. And then as the ethics counselor, I tell everybody else they can't do what they do want to do. So it's basically my job. Okay, so I just would like to cover 3 topics today to re-emphasize to the choir why this is all important. Give one case example, and I was thrilled that the former case example was on cell validation and not antibody validation, because if it were, then I'd have absolutely nothing to talk about that was different. And then to tell you a little bit about some of the things that the National Institutes of Health are doing policy-wise. So the importance of rigor and reproducibility is really embedded within the NIH strategic plan. You may wonder why I would highlight the NIH strategic plan. Well, it's because we haven't had one before. And I had the privilege of leading the group that put this thing together a few years ago. The clock is ticking. It's through 2020. That tells you something about my lifespan at the agency, because somebody else is going to do the next one. But within the enhancing stewardship portion of this strategic plan is indeed to ensure rigor and reproducibility. And the reasons, I think, are self-evident to this group. I'm actually surprised that nobody brought up my favorite book called Rigor Mortis. I'm a little disappointed in all of you, and if anybody wants to borrow this slide for other presentations, let me know. Actually, the book by Richard Harris is not a bad book. It's actually pretty good. The title, not so much, but the book is actually quite good. And in it, of course, he elaborates on many of the things that you've already heard about, and I need not belabor. And of course, at least from the NIH perspective, much of this started in the Neurology Institute. Shai Silberberg and Story Landis really took issue, appropriately so, with underpowered and improperly conducted antecedent animal work to first-in-human trials, and basically called out the entire field. And this really began the efforts at NIH in a big way. So updated in 2017, so how are we doing? The summary is not so well. So if you look at the percentage of studies that report randomization, I guess if you work in pigs, you get to know them real well, and so you know that they're randomized, but all those mice look the same, so what's the difference, right? And there you are. I mean, very few studies that report that. Blinding, again, not so well, but my favorite is sample size calculation. The caption should read, "What's a sample size calculation?" Because basically nobody reports it. Doesn't mean that they're not doing it, but they surely don't report it. I mean, if you think of animal studies throughout history, the first animal study that was done used a perfect number of animals. It was Noah when he released the doves, right? It was the first animal study. And look it up for those of you. Okay. So, and this has already been alluded to, and actually there are people in the room here who actually understand the math, so I'm going to tread very lightly here. But basically, it's a law of small numbers. And, large samples are more precise than small samples, except when they're not. And this morning we heard of, some examples of just because something's significant, is it really significant, biologically speaking. And so, again, this is from Nature Reviews Neuroscience, and if you look at the two commonly used maze trials, and the number of animals that one would require for an 80% or 95% power, they're about an order of magnitude more than we typically see in the published literature. So we're producing a lot of small, little, underpowered animal studies, and what's the good of that? So, and of course, funders are now taking notice, and the UK in particular has come out very strongly about this. And again, this was earlier discussed, the fact that the holy grail of 0.05, which I must say is the only thing I remember from my statistics course, is insufficient in many instances and leads to all sorts of issues, including p-hacking and so forth. And there are data now to show that maybe we should be looking at, for biological systems, a p-value, if you're going to use that type of statistics, to 0.005. And wouldn't that change things? Now go through your catalog of all the papers that you published, and and I think you would say that this would change things enormously. So this is my only Nature paper in my whole career, and I know it was only published because Francis was the first author, but it's fine. The plans to enhance reproducibility. But it really was, sort of an initial articulation of the steps that the agency was going to take. And fast forward a number of years, and again, this was also alluded to earlier with emphasis on bucket 4 on authentication. But the other 3 buckets, the need to talk about premise. When you are citing your own work as the antecedent evidence for why your idea is a reasonable one, that's called preliminary data, and in fact that's looked at pretty carefully in peer review. But if you're citing somebody else's work, not so much. And what if you're citing my work and my work isn't so strong, and it is on that shaky premise that you're writing a grant application? So this sort of turns the tide. The scientific premise needs to be looked at. Design, of course, we've heard a great deal about, as have we heard about variables. So you've heard about a number of these things. My main message here is, and others have said this, this is a team sport. NIH alone can't do this. NSF alone can't do this. The Academy can't do this alone. Everybody needs to work at this, universities, societies, the Academy, the funding agencies, you as individual reviewers, you as individual investigators, you as mentors, you as teachers. We all are in this together. Cell lines, scary stuff. If you haven't done it, spend $100 and get your cells sequenced. I did. It's scary, okay? Um, Antibodies, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, and then studying both sexes. Now, usually, if I had a little more time, this is where I get to talk about sex, and I get really excited. But I'm not going to talk about it today. Just to draw your attention to this really good review article that my colleague Janine Clayton put together, laying out the scientific case about why boys and girls are different, and you have to study them as a result, okay? Let's talk about protein capture reagents and an example of something that NIH has tried to do to move the ball forward a little bit. Now, Brian talked about his fourth grader. I have a fourth grader also, except it's my grandson, not my son, which means I'm old enough to have made all the antibodies myself that I used in my lab when I was running a lab. All right, now think about that for a moment. Those of you who are nodding, oh yeah, I did also. I know what generation you're from, and that's why those antibodies work, because you purified the immunogen, you inoculated the animal, you watched the titer, you did everything yourself. You were your own quality control. No more. No more. We buy everything. And the result is poor quality of unvalidated reagents, and this contributes mightily to the problem. And of course, Leonard has published and talked about this extensively. And there are all sorts of reasons why this is, but in general, they're just not good reagents, okay? And yet, we just use them without validating what their value or lack thereof is. So NIH put together a pilot program over the last 5 or so years, a protein capture program. We created a production pipeline. We started as targets human transcription factors. The NIH director was really excited about transcription factors. I try to convince him to study glycosyltransferases. That's why he's the director. So we did human transcription factors. And a bunch of antibodies were made, and they were distributed through a data portal. And what's interesting about this is, even though a tremendous amount of effort and work went into this, it is probably one of our more underutilized resources, because it's more convenient to go to your favorite vendor, just rotely tick a box and get something in a vial which may or may not work. Or it works, but it's not seeing what you think it is. Have any of you ever, when you reviewed a paper or reviewed a grant, said, have you validated the antibody that was used? So 2 papers ago, I had a reviewer ask me that. And so what do? I go to the postback and I say, so did you do this experiment that we talked about? And she did it. And we were able to send it back in. And like in 3 days, everything was resolved. But had she not, we would have had a problem. But I give tremendous credit to that reviewer. Tremendous credit to that reviewer. So do that thought experiment. The next time you buy that antibody, have you validated it with your own hands? So here we have this web portal. I have the link up there. If you're interested in transcription factors, there's a bunch of reagents there that you might find extremely useful, because a number of them have, in fact, been validated, 450 tested to date, and 20% of the 450 have been successfully validated. Not a great batting average, but nevertheless, it gives you a sense of what you're facing when you buy things blindly. So I will now just turn to the final point of developing additional policy here. And for me, this all started when we got a bunch of journal editors together, including Marcia when she was at the Science magazine. Now, one of the fun parts of my job is I get to herd cats. They're called Institute and Center directors. That's nothing compared to having 50 journal editors in a room to write a 1-page document, which they were all going to edit. But they did it. And in fact, there was these two, multiple journals published the same editorial simultaneously, both in Nature and Science in this instance. FASEB did as well. And really what this articulated was the firm understanding that this is a team sport, that we all have to do this in order to succeed. Now, the Congress has gotten interested in this, and I don't want to bore you with the law and all this other stuff, but welcome to my world. You know, we have to think about these things very, very carefully. And Section 2039 told us to create a working group of the advisory committee to the director of NIH, and indeed, that has been done. Mike Lauer has done yeoman's work with this together with Russ Altman, who is his co-chair, and they have been working to articulate and outline the approach to furthering our policies in this space. The timeline for doing this is displayed here, and indeed, we have to send a report to Congress within the next month or so. And I'm pleased to say that the report's actually just about done, and we will be on time and under budget, as they say. So that's good. The recommendations talk about, and this is going to all come as a big surprise to you, because this is what we've been talking about the entire day, talking about the resources needed to ensure rigor, the need to clarify scientific premise and move it to approach, provide examples of authentication plans, training and rigor scored, and outcomes evaluation. So the current instructions on scientific premise are on the top. On the bottom of the proposed revisions, so instead of significance, it'll be under the approach. And the new language will read, describe the strengths and weaknesses in the rigor of the prior research, both published and unpublished, that serve as the foundation for your proposed project. Similarly, under significance, it will now be under approach. Does the application describe strengths and weaknesses in the rigor of the prior research that serves as the foundation for the proposed project? And does the application include a plan to address identified weaknesses? In other words, you know, where you know there are gaps in the knowledge, you've got to be able to explain them, or at least come up with an approach that might allow you to redress them. And then, of course, in terms of examples of plans, we are going to solicit authentication plans from Program Leadership Committee, and we'll post them online for the extramural communities. Training, this has already been described, and so I need not proceed with any detailed thing, but eventually this will inform NIH-wide adoption and all training mechanisms. Continued outcomes evaluations. So we make all these policy changes. It's incumbent upon us to figure out if they're having the right effect or an untoward effect. And so there is an ongoing set of evaluations, both at the institute and center level, as well as within the Office of Extramural Research. Here are a series of resources. I don't expect you to copy the links down, but they'll be in your packet. And another set of resources on rigor. And the last slide is just to give you my email address, because there are always 3 people in the back of the room who have an important question, but you're afraid to ask it. Email me. I promise to get back to you. It will be at a weird time of day, but I will get back to you. Thank you.
Great. So that's our first perspective, and as I say, we're going to go through both of the talks first, and then engage in the dialogue. So the second perspective is going to be from the National Science Foundation, and we're pleased to have Dr. Arthur Lupia. He is the brand new head of the National Science Foundation Directorate for Social Behavior and Economic Sciences. He has more than 25 years in leadership experience in the social science community. He was a professor in political science at the University of Michigan. Some examples of some of the things that he has been doing along this line are that he is the chairman of board for the Center for Open Science and the chair of the National Academy's Roundtable on Communications and Use of Social and Behavioral Sciences. He's had leadership in the National Academy of Science activities and AAAS as well. And I would say that I first met him 2 years ago when he did an absolutely fabulous talk on communications to the public, to AAU. And so he can speak to us, I guess, today from both perspectives. Art?
Thank you. Thanks for having me here. I want to start by asking you for a favor, okay? I'm going to ask everyone for a favor. Could you stand up? I just need you to stand up. All right. This is a good thing to do at 2:45 in the afternoon. So we did each other a favor, just if you're keeping score. But if you're standing up right now, I want to thank you for being part of this day where we are engaging in really critical questions about how we know what we know. By my accounting, today is a critical day in the history of science because we're asking each other really essential questions about how do we create value and how do we approach our responsibility to one another, to society, to all the people who make, science possible. These are very important questions. Thank you for your participation. You may be seated. So here's a question for us all. The golden age of science, is it ahead of us or was it behind us? I think ultimately it's up to us, right? And so let's think about what we have in front of us. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about three things. First, I've only been at the National Academies for a couple weeks, so I'm going to talk about them last. And they're doing some really important things, but I'm going to lead up to that moment. So first, a little bit of background about how I've come to this. I'm going to tell you about my biases, just so we're clear about that up front. So I'll talk about my orientation to topics like this. Then I'll talk about a challenge that all of us have, a shared problem that I think all of us have. And then we'll talk about relevant policies at the National Science Foundation. My own background, when I still do some research, and most of my work is on how people make decisions when they don't know very much, which conveniently is always. And a big part of that is trying to figure out how people choose what and who to believe. Inherent in that work are questions about the origins of credibility, or how to sustain credibility under challenging circumstances. Like Aaron, I came to a lot of this through mathematics. What does math have to do with credibility? The idea is if you know a little bit about perception, a little bit about memory, a little bit about incentives, how does credibility arise under various dynamic combinations of these things? So I have put together models of things of this nature. Now, I don't expect you to read that, and it's not just because the font is small. But there is this tradition in math, right? Which is if I claim to know something about the origins of credibility and I walk into a room and people expect me to have a proof. And if I don't have a proof, I am laughed out of the room, right? And I'm not invited back, right? And what's interesting about a proof in mathematics is it has a couple of functions. One is it kind of demonstrates that you can do it, but to me the cooler part of a mathematical proof is that it's taught to students, is that other people look at it. And if you actually approach a proof the right way, then you've done it too. Right? You've actually completed the process too. And so it's this amazing thing to be part of a scientific process where if a mathematical paper is written the right way, you can go from the beginning to the end and you've discovered the same result. Right? So that's a neat thing. So that's my initial bias. I come at this from a mathematical perspective. But for me, the dependent variable of interest has always been quality of life. And so the question is, how do you take things like this and really try and improve people's lives? Because of the type of work that I do, I've been asked over the years to advise a number of organizations on how to communicate more effectively. I was with the National Academies and so forth, and that's really important. But one way to get a lot of attention in science is to scream something like, coffee cures cancer, right? Or popcorn cures cancer, or whatever it is this week. That's a way to get attention. But a trick for science communication is not only to get attention, but to say things that you can defend in the process, things that may be high-dimensional, things that may be complicated, things that may be associated with uncertainty. How do you say that in a way such that people will be interested in the content and hum the right tune on the way out of the room? So that's an important question for us all, because right now science coexists in society with pop culture. And in pop culture, there are many people who claim to be experts about things that we care about. And so many people struggle with how do we communicate these things. So anyways, my career continues. I'm asked to give advice, and at some point, I give advice to enough science organizations that other people start asking me for advice, particularly governments. So I spent a lot of 2015 and 2016 in other countries. One country where I spent a lot of time was Colombia. That's me, and that's the president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos. He is, and that you may remember, Colombia had a civil war that went for 60 years. It was devastating to the country. And so there were times like this where I'd be asked, what should I do? That is a really, it's a surreal moment, by the way. I grew up on a farm. But it's a strange moment to start to think about, is the literature I'm about to reference based on false positives? Are the articles that I'm going to cite based on p-hacking? Because when I answer this question, there's a very good chance that they're going to do some version of what I've said. And millions of lives are at stake, right? And I've been in places where I've seen, great things, and I've also seen devastation and tragedy of a scale that is difficult to imagine. And so at moments like this, the people that I want, sort of having my back in a sense, are folks who are doing science in a way to help me distinguish what is plausible and what's implausible, what's true and what's not. This story ended well, as you know. They figured out a way to come up with a peace process. I can talk about the role of science. It was really fascinating in it. This is President Santos, and President Santos since won the Nobel Prize, right? So there are times when we can have a big impact. Now, I don't have to tell you guys this, right? I mean, there are a lot of folks in this room that are in medicine. So those of us in the sciences, sometimes our effect on people is remote, and I think in medicine sometimes it's up close. But in many cases, our work, both individually and collectively, can have huge effects on the lives of people we will never meet. And so the question I ask myself every day is, are we serving them as well as we can? And can we try to improve every day? Right, so these are my biases are now on the table. This is what motivates me to do this type of work. So with that, I want to talk about a problem that we might all have now. And I'm assuming I'm assuming that you weren't randomly selected to be here. So now I'm going to assume a bias of yours, which is that you care about the effect of science. So here's some things to think about. Where are we at this moment, and what can we do to improve the value of what we do? So I would say that we probably have a shared mission. And that shared mission is to provide insights, ideas, inspiration to different types of people. We might be interested in students, right? And we might be interested in young students or undergraduates or graduates or lifelong learners. We may be interested in people who teach, or people who teach and do research, or people who teach and do research and do service. And we may be interested in all of the folks that people like this have an effect on which they have an effect. And what is it that we give to them? Well, one description of what we give to them is clarity. Sometimes clarity is in the form of, here's a process and here's how it works. Right? Sometimes clarity comes in the form of, you see this thing that seemed complicated? Actually, there's a fundamental principle behind it, and we can apply it in cases to be more effective. In some cases, clarity comes from the claim that, you see this thing that looks simple? Actually a little more complicated, and it matters. So clarity is an amazing thing to convey to people. Now, there's two forms in which we convey this clarity. So we can talk about the two products that we sell, in a sense, and one is information and the other is meaning. So when I say that we sell information, we collect data, we collect observations, and we distribute them, sometimes only to ourselves, and sometimes we share it with others. So information. The other thing we do is meaning, that is through putting observations into categories, analyzing the categories, interpreting the analyses. We tell people what observations mean. Right? So many of, whether it's a book or a video or a seminar or so forth, information and meaning are the things that we convey. And that's great, except for one thing. In the last, you can pick a number of years, but in the last 10 years, the marketplace for things like information and meaning have completely transformed. On May 10th, 1950, the day that the National Science Foundation was formed, the typical American household had between 10 and 30 books in it. If you wanted other books, you could go to a library. which was easier if you lived in a city and most people didn't. If you went to a library, you could borrow a book or perhaps two for 2 weeks. And if you wanted to take content from that book and retain it to yourself, you would have to handwrite notes to retain the content. Now you might say, oh, but that's pretty limiting, but of course I could drive. Driving was very expensive. On a per capita basis, there were 1/3 as many vehicles of any kind as there are today. You might say, maybe I could call someone for scientific information. In 1950, the cost of a 10-minute phone call from New York to Los Angeles was $6.70 in 1950 dollars. That's about $70 today. So those of you who are complaining about the cost of your unlimited plans, I just want to put that in a context. But the point is, for most of human history, information on most topics was really scarce. And today we live in this amazing moment where information on so many topics is readily available. And that seems great, but it brings a headwind to people like us. Because the question now is, why should I believe you? Or why should I even pay attention to your information? Because there's other information online that I like better, because it tells me exactly what I want to hear, and it makes me feel great about myself. And I prefer that information, okay? So that's an important question, but it's not a silly question. It can be a serious question, because the United States Congress is asking questions about what types of information should we pay for. And now here's where things get interesting, because we can say, well, there's this frivolous information, of course they shouldn't pay for it. But this morning we heard that maybe there are doubts about the replicability and other important products of many scientific types of information. So the question about what should we pay for and should we trust you now become a little more real, right? And so what we have in our culture is a crisis of credibility. Who can we believe? And of course, it filters in all kinds of decision making, but it affects us too. And so let's talk about us now. How is it today that people use scientific information? Okay? So we can think about what's the value of our research today in the age of the internet. Okay? So we can enjoy science just to explore and discover, and that's really important. Exploring and discover. But ultimately, when the government decides to pay for science, they typically tend to want something. It doesn't have to be immediate applications, but there does have to be a rationale. All right? So, one thing that people think about are decisions. Decisions that are going to be made in the future by doctors, by farmers, by people who run companies, by caregivers for the elderly, right? By school teachers. There's going to be a decision. And one thing we know about decisions is decisions rely on evaluations. That is, someone takes information that somehow they analyze, interpret it, and they give it to you, and this is an evaluation. And it helps you think about, okay, how would I make a decision? Evaluations are necessarily based on the past. All of our data, by necessity, comes from the past, right? Until you guys invent a time machine, that's the only way we can have it. So that's interesting. So now, even if we want to understand the present and the future, we're trying to figure out, well, which of these evaluations are most relevant, okay? And so here we are in 2018, and everybody has an opinion, particularly if you're in the social sciences. If you're not in the social sciences, here's how it works. I walk by a dollar bill. I'm an economist. I voted. Oh, I can write a 500-word thing under any Washington Post article, and it's just as good as the article, right? That's where we live today. But many of us, if we want to make decisions and the quality of lives of ourselves, our families, our communities, or our nations are at stake, how we choose what to believe is a little more rigorous. It's a little more important. So the question becomes, which evaluations should we believe? So I want to talk to you about two properties that an evaluation can have, right? So one property is credibility. And what do I mean by credibility? It's the quality of being believable or trustworthy. That is, it has some attribute that distinguishes it from all the noise to make you want to believe it. And we'll talk in a moment about what kinds of science today have this attribute. Now, I want to distinguish it from another attribute that is also important to think about if you're a scientist, and that's legitimacy. Okay? And by legitimacy, I mean it's in accordance with a recognized or accepted standard or principle. Legitimacy really matters because it allows us to disagree. That is, we may come to a different conclusion, but if I see how you came to it, I might be able to say, okay, someone who started from where you were and took the steps you took would get to that point. I started somewhere else and took these steps. We can have, if we see each other's arguments as legitimate, we can collaborate and have really interesting conversations because we can pinpoint where we disagree. If we don't have a basis for seeing one another as legitimate, it's really hard to collaborate. You see it in politics, but you can also see it in science. Some of the stories we've heard before about, I'm going to make one point early in my career and defend it forever, right? Part of what allows you to maintain that strategy is by seeing everything else as illegitimate. Not having transparency in our scientific practice makes it easier for people to see everybody else as legitimate. If we got to a culture where more was open, it would be harder to maintain that stance, okay? So, the value of scientific research today, in this era in which we live, our real opportunity is that we are a potential source for evaluations that are more credible and legitimate than many of the other things that are out there in pop culture. Right? That's our opportunity, but how do we get there? All right? This is one of my favorite quotes. I have one from Richard Feynman, who I met, though not in 1974, because I was reading Spider-Man at that point. But Richard Feynman at this address talked about scientific integrity corresponds to a kind of utter honesty, right? And the point that he went on to make, what does utter honesty mean? It means giving people all of the information that gives them the context to evaluate your claim, and not just information that leads to a particular direction. It was good advice then, it's good advice now, right? And to the extent that we take this day to figure out how we can do better on that regard, we have great potential to create more credible and legitimate evaluations. But our current practices, as Brian Nosek said at lunch, value the publication over the explanation, right? We've heard a lot of stories today about the tenure committee wanting to know the number of articles and not the content, okay? And I want to just twist the knife a little more to remind us of what's at stake. Because the current practices we have today, right, look, dark clouds, these are current practices. Today, many researchers have strong incentives to discover and publish, but weak incentives to explain how the discoveries emerged. So let's think about what this implies, right? And that is more darkness. This slide, I didn't think this, all right, so this is what we want. These are all the things that we don't tell ourselves we want, but we want all these great things. Salary motivates us, health insurance, grants, and all the other things. And even though we don't say it, if we play the game correctly, we get the prizes, right? So that's the idea. But the dark side of this game, right, is that these current practices affect the meaning of individual studies. We have questions knowing what we believe. But the bigger risk here is it threatens the meaning of a scientific consensus. All right, so I'll be controversial for a second. The stories that we've told today, have we done the study of climate science yet? And if we did a study of climate science and we found that there were replications problems there, or there were publication biases, what would the implications be? And I'll just say, if that frightens you, I want to go back to the scientific norms that Brian Nosek told about. If you're really committed to science, we should want to know the answers. We should want to know. But this is what's at stake, all right? So that's the end of the dark part of the presentation. Now the question is, what can we do? And it's the end of the dark part of the conversations because the clouds come back. All right, so this is the visual signal of the change. All right, so the opportunity that we have, I think, we've talked about the future and culture change, and I totally believe in culture change, but for me, it's not about tomorrow, it's about today. And it's not about somebody else, it's about you and me right now. And the great thing is, the point in the history of science where we are, there are things that we can do. Now, a lot of us is thinking about how do we integrate transparency incentives into the academic ecosystem. So I mentioned before I grew up on a farm, so there's an idea I have. I don't know how many of you have ever been fishing, but as it happens, the fish are pretty indifferent as to where you are. They just don't think about you, they don't care. So if you want to catch fish, you have to go to where they are. That's not very hard. But when we think about how to integrate ourselves into an academic ecosystem, it's like, well, where do the fish swim in academics? They swim to the journals. They want to get published, at least for right now. And they want to get published in the highfalutin journals. So one of the ideas that many of us had, including Center for Open Science, is can we hit the incentives system right there? Can we make greater transparency, practices that lead to replicability, more aspirational at these key moments? And as Brian Nosek talked about before, as Marcia talked about, there's some initial signs of success, right? So one of the things is if you've ever been an editor of a journal, here's one thing you know. You work 25 hours a day, 8 days a week, and if somebody asks you to do something new, they're Charlie Brown's mother. You just don't have time to hear it. So if you want to change the incentives, the question is, can you provide something that is easy for them to implement and consistent with their own values, right? And there are things you can do, right? You can articulate standards. You can kind of give them plug-and-play language to help them say, we believe in science, we believe in the reproducibility of findings, and we want manuscripts sent to this journal to be of a certain character, so we can hold our heads up tomorrow and say, this is science that you can count on. It might be wrong, but we know where it came from, right? So plug-and-play infrastructure. A number of organizations, Center for Open Science, again, among them, building this infrastructure to make it easier for people who are overburdened to change the incentive system in good ways, right? I was involved in this in an effort in political science, where the key thing is if you want to change incentive structures, the most important thing you have to do is listen. Because if you walk into town like the sheriff and say, we're going to change the rule, you've just made enemies. If you listen to people and you hear what their aspirations are, and then, here's a math term, you find a non-empty intersection between their aspirations and incentives that facilitate reproducibility, if that intersection is non-empty, now you've got a policy. Now you've got a policy that can actually take hold, right? So we did this here, right? And the Center for Open Science, and Marcia and Brian Nosek, and I think maybe 20 people, I don't know how many people in this room were on the article, but you've seen the article, the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines. We've already talked about it, but what's the right number, Dr. Nosek? What is the number of organizations or journals who are presently signers of the top guidelines? You don't know, okay. You heard 5,000, I heard 8,000. I got yelled at the last time I said 5,000, but it's a lot. And what the great thing is for the top guidelines, journals are now sending a message, right? And messaging is so important because particularly for younger scholars where they're trying to figure out, well, first of all, they're all having an existential crisis before tenure, do I belong, right? And to give them validation to say, you know what, doing science in a particular way, right, will help you get into the best journals, right? That can be validating. One great thing, my Mount Olympus for open science includes, Brian and Marcia, and the reason I'm talking about Marcia is for the top guidelines, the first 2 journals to sign on were Science and Nature. When you start at the top of the food chain, a lot of the other journals, it's not just people that look around, it's like the other journals like, hey, maybe we should do that too. That's how you scale up to 5,000 or 8,000 in 3 or 4 years. Just a little tip. All right, so we have that. But there are other easy ways to do this. In qualitative research, there are some, you might just think this is about numbers, but there are lots of people building infrastructure for qualitative research. That data can be harder to archive and document, but there are people with really creative ideas about how to create reward systems for people who do qualitative research. So it's not just a numbers thing. This is my favorite, though. You've seen it today. Again, another way to explain it is when you're in kindergarten or 2nd grade and somebody puts gold stars and you bring it home, it goes right on the fridge, right? The gold stars, they're like 100 of them and you get them for 39 cents. They cost nothing, but they create this amazing joy in children and joy in parents and joy in grandparents. Why not create a little joy for free? The open badges, they cost very little to put into your ecosystem. And they are now gold stars that many of your younger scholars want to have on their articles, right? So again, we're talking about we need a culture change, and we certainly do. But there are things we can do today, like this, that make a big difference. So let me talk now about, so now I'm going to put my NSF hat on. I actually don't have a hat, I just have a little badge. I want to talk a little bit about what the National Science Foundation is doing. What I will tell you is that at NSF, open science is a totally open conversation. There is great interest in it. Today, NSF is really focused on broad, collaborative, interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary work. You may know about the Big Idea program that really tries to bring scholars from all areas together, have very dynamic leadership, France Cordova. And people are thinking dynamically about the conversation we're having today. So NSF is a government agency, and so we do have a mission, and so everything we do in the open science context has to be mission consistent. So our mission is to promote the progress of science, to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare, and to secure the national defense. It also says "and other things," but people forget that. There it is. In terms of the policies, a big focal point for our current policies is what's called the Holdren memo. Okay? So the Office of Science and Technology policy in 2015 asked all large federal agencies to develop an open access policy, gave them time to do it, gave them some general guidelines. And so our current policies really build off of the Holdren memo. What are these policies? The most detailed part deals with publications. So starting in January of 2016, if you had a proposal submitted after that, then any article you publish, so this is on the open access side, in a peer-reviewed manuscript or a juried conference proceeding, has to be published in the NSF Public Access Repository. And here's the website. So, they're all there. You have to have free access to it for no later than 12 months after publication. So if you're publishing in a journal right now that says, it can't be public right away, NSF says that's fine for 12 months, but then it's got to be available to everyone. And the argument here is the taxpayers paid for your work, so they should have access to it. And also when you write your annual checkups, your annual reports, you have to talk about the contributions that you made to the public access repository. So that's publications. On the data side, the data now, this is actually, I think it dates back to 2011, but every NSF grantee has to have a data management plan. What happens next varies by directorate, and that's a lot of what we're talking about right now. So some directorates require that you deposit data in a particular type of repository. Others are looser, and just from NSF's perspective, if you're asking, well, why can't you just have one rule? Data comes in lots of shapes and sizes. Knowledge communities have lots of different expectations about how much supplementary material you would need to make sense of data if it were available. So one size fits all is difficult, right? So right now NSF you have to have a data management plan. Some directorates require more, but there is variance. The other thing that NSF is really involved in now is the conversation, because the conversation is ongoing in all parts of the district. So we have a public access working group. We have a lot of community outreach. We've funded a number of things at the national academies and elsewhere to try and push these things forward. And then NSF, I think importantly, is participating in an interagency working group on social science, which is now, I don't quite understand all the accounting, but now it's been renamed to the Subcommittee on Open Science, and this is a promotion. I haven't seen the org chart, so I'm just going to take that one on faith. So this is the view of the national academies, but to bring it back to the bigger picture, I happen to believe that we're on the cusp of a golden age of science. I think it's right in front of us, and here's why. If you think of the diversity of methods and people that are now involved in science, both are unprecedented. All of the views that we get, all of the different ways we can look at data and evidence. There's never in the history of science been this many people involved. We think about, the National Academy, or NSF, the National Academy just wrote a great report on sexual harassment. NSF just came out with policies really changing so we can create scientific cultures where everyone can be involved and we can focus on the science, right? And when we had that conversation simultaneous with the conversation we're having today, just think about, we're thinking a lot about what can go wrong. Imagine what can go right if we solve those two problems. Or not, solve might be the wrong word, but suppose we make progress. Suppose that, 5 years from now, Johnny Anita stands up here and says, the replication rate went from 1.2% to something like in high double digits. So now we've got this amazing science enterprise. And again, if we think about the people on the other end of the equation, right, the people who are receiving our clarity, the teachers, the students, and the millions of people we will never meet whose lives are affected by students, I think that this golden age of science is worth fighting for. And my view is that fight begins today in rooms like this. There are so many people in this room who have done great things, and we need to recognize that. But every day we have a new opportunity to build from what's been done and do it one better. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your contributions to this conversation, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great. Good to start the dialogue on a positive note. Unsurprisingly, our two speakers have touched on a lot of the issues that have come up in many of the sessions today, and I think that's not a surprise because, of course, from the perspective of the agencies, they're dealing with activities across all the stakeholder groups that we've been talking to or about. So if you have questions or comments to make on either of these that have been that have just finished up, then feel free to walk up to either one of these microphones. And Marcia.
Yeah, Skip, you talked about the Holdren memo. What do you think about Plan S? And do you have thoughts about how that could impact the future publishing enterprise, particularly? And let me just tell you what my concern is. You know, we've all seen that without some kind of thought put in, I'm worried that if there's simply a edict that all journals must be open access and there is a cap put on the costs, that all journals will quickly move to be open access at that cap, and we will have a proliferation of predatory journals that will cut costs, accept as many papers as possible to become as profitable as possible by cutting services, and that it may not be a publishing ecosystem that is as diverse and maybe one that isn't necessarily in the best interests of the research enterprise. And I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Thank you. Before I take the question on, I should probably just explain what Plan S is.
Yeah, good idea.
Yeah, so several weeks ago, a joint memo was signed by science funding agencies, or I don't remember if it's the agencies themselves or an affiliated, I don't know if the ones who write the checks or the ones who oversees the ones who write the checks, but from 11 European countries signed a joint memo. And Plan S is a plan basically for open access in a way that we're not familiar with today. So key points of Plan S. No embargoes. So if one of the 11 countries, if one of the agencies has funded your research and you publish it, it cannot be published in a journal that has an embargo period. The embargo, 0 embargoes. You are not allowed to publish in a hybrid journal where you're sort of mixing embargoes and page charges and things of that nature. There's an open copyright where you retain the copyright, and there's talk of capping page charges, although there isn't an explicit description of how they would be charged. There's also a reference to data, but it isn't very precise. So that's what it is, and I will just tell you, NSF does not have an official position on Plan S as of this moment. I can tell you that open access is a big conversation in Washington. And one thing that's obvious, right, if the first sentence of an argument is taxpayers and the public should have access to the research that they've paid for, that's a very compelling premise, right? So what you have to think about next, and part of it's a science problem, is what happens to the publication ecosystem, right? So there are different types of entities that make scientific journals. Some are made for profit companies, and there are some evidence that they have very big margins. And I think that's a focal point for some of Plan S. Other journals are put forward by scientific societies. And there's a fear that if we went to, let's say I run a professional organization. People have a membership to my organization, and I believe that most people pay for a membership to get exclusive access to the journal, and the reason they want exclusive access to the journal is because the journal has embargoes. There's some content in the journal that isn't available to everyone, so that's why I join. There are, in fact, a range of professional organizations, and some are in that position and some are not in that position, right? Many professional organizations bundle, they sell you a conference and things of that nature. So I have not yet seen data on what part of the academic ecosystem would be affected, right? So one thing we know from economics is if you set the page charges too low, right, we're going to go to the situation where we basically have glorified working paper series and predatory journals, and that'll be all that's left. You know, if you set the page charges high, another problem could emerge. Marcia, you and I could run the best journal in a particular field, and depending on the revenue model of our organization, we might decide to go the other way. We might say, we're going to have a higher page charge because we're so prestigious that we know people want to pay it, right? And so that, you know, you could have premium brands, kind of like Apple. No offense to those of you who have iPhones, but seriously. Right? It's a premium brand. And so, like, you might say, okay, I like having an Apple iPhone, but there's lots of people who can't afford an Apple iPhone. If we go to that model where we have what economists call price discrimination, now your ability to get in a top-end journal is even, you know, it may be less about your work and more about whether you have friends with money, right, or whether you live in countries with money. So it is something that we're thinking about. The architects of Plan S have been through Washington. They've met with us. They've probably met with you guys. You know, I think they're still and just for what it's worth, not all of the European countries have signed on to this, so it's controversial even in Europe. But they've raised some very interesting questions.
Maybe I'll ask a question at maybe a combination of in the weeds and high level, and that is we have these different disciplines that are thinking about ways of making access and data available to people, and I think that in the disciplines maybe the cultures and norms and even the data sets are different. And then we have agencies who are trying to help us in our culture change by making requirements for proposals and grant and activities that are done under the auspices of that sponsorship. I get a little concerned about the fact that we're going to end up having so many multiple ways of so many multiple sets of requirements that it's going to be challenging for us to implement. But then on the other hand, I wonder if because our disciplines are so disparate that there's no other choice. So I wonder if either of you have anything to say about that.
Well, I guess we're more homogeneous than the NSF. Our institutes and centers are all about biomedical research, and a kidney's the same thing as a retina. I mean, it's all the same, right? So sorry to all of you who are urologists or ophthalmologists, but so in addition to the rules, the regulations to try and facilitate or encourage people, we're also trying to come up with resources that are rational as to where to put the data, right? So PubMed now, which I think most people are familiar with, now allows you to deposit data sets that are associated with the publication that didn't make it into the publication. So this is different than just supplemental data.
Right.
And that will likely be expanded in the not too distant future to include other related sorts of data sets. Yardage in the cloud now is so inexpensive that you can contemplate things like this. So it's true that we worry about, are our rules harmonized with the NSF rules, with the DOE rules,
Right,
with the DOD rules? But at the same time, we are trying to provide some practical ways forward and, for a place to deposit all these things.
Yep.
Yeah. I'll say from the NSF side, on the open access publication side of this equation, NSF actually has just really, it has really simple rules. If you got a grant, if you submitted a grant after January 2016, any refereed conference paper or journal articles goes in the repository. And it doesn't actually, this policy doesn't preclude people publishing in journals with embargoes, right? Because you can embargo it up for a year, you can put a working paper in and it counts. So that part's really simple. Where things get sort of more diverse is on the data side, right? And our mission and our obligation at NSF is to try and provide maximum data for maximum value to the public for the things that we provide, for the research that we fund. And so much of what's been talked about here is ultimately about the value of that of what's being done, the value of the data, the value of the findings, and so forth. So, I don't know that we're going to converge to a simple set of rules about this. in part because different knowledge communities, again, they have different rules. They deal with different types of data. And I think, I know in my experience before NSF, if you look like the outsider trying to impose your rules, you're dead.
Yeah.
You're a dead letter, even if you have a reasonable argument. So I don't see NSF getting in that business. But ultimately, I think we want to minimize burden on researchers, conditional on researchers acting in ways that maximize the value of their work to the public.
Right, great, okay. Comment or question?
Hi, I'm Judith Carano from the University of Pennsylvania, and I want to ask a question about that maximizing benefit to the public. So it's certainly beneficial to some members of the public to have the data and to have the publication in hand. But what about those members of the public who wouldn't be able to derive full benefit from the data or the publication because they don't know a lot about that particular field? What ideas are there for helping the public to understand the science that went on in words that resonate with the education that they've had?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, and this is echoing what Marcia McNutt said about science communication. Brian Baird, who is a PhD in psychology, also was a member of Congress for 12 years, has this great analogy that he uses for this situation. He says, today in science, like, we have the best factory ever, and we make the best products ever. And then when we look out into the shipping yard, how we get them to the public, we forgot to buy trucks, right? We don't really think about how, we have this ecosystem about publication. Our ecosystem is also, I need to learn to talk to people who are just like me, right? The ideal paper reviewer is someone who has the same values that I do, same methods that I do, same topic. The ideal conference discussant is somebody just like me. We have not trained people to tell accurate stories about their research. And there's in what I'm about to say, there's a falsehood that you might be tempted to hear. Sometimes you think there's a difference between explaining science as it is and dumbing, or you think you have two choices, explain science as it is or dumb it down. That is a false dichotomy. That appears to be the only two choices because we have never really tried, right? So the question is, how do you tell a science story in a way that people can hear? And one thing so I cheat because I study memory and learning and things of that nature. One thing that I know is I can't teach you anything. I can't. But what I can do is, the only things I can do when I make a presentation are vary sound and light. Here I'm varying light, and now I'm varying sound. Those are my only two tricks. For you to learn anything from what I'm doing, I have to organize light and sound in a way that you are so inspired by it or so motivated by it that you take the variations in light and sound and you try and work them in your own categorizational framework, right? All learning requires co-production. And the way to think, if this is too hard to think about, here's another way. Think for a moment about your favorite song. Do you have a favorite song? Close your eyes. Can you hear it? Okay. I'm going to tell you something. I'm not a mind reader, but I know what you just heard. I know what you just heard. It wasn't all, a Bee Gees song. That was just some of you. But what I know is that the song that you just heard is not actually the song that was on the radio. It's a different version. It's missing some of the arrangements. Some of the words are altered. If you've ever seen the videos where you try and sing a song and it's the different word, you co-produced your own version. So the way that we learn a song is we sit near earphones or we sit near a radio, we hear the song, we listen to the patterns, and we co-produce our own versions that we can carry out with us. Co-production is the key to learning. So the key to science communication is finding the way to talk about our methods and our findings in ways that resonate with the core concerns of the audience at that moment, such that they will be so motivated by it that they'll co-produce their own version. That requires us to learn so much more about our audiences than we typically do now. But the point is, and I love us all, but since we've been so bad at this for so long, the doing better is not that hard. So I think if we take the National Academy's things on science communication, I like to think of what we do as teaching people not to slash their own tires before they leave the driveway. And I think if we do more of that, then more people can get the benefits of really rigorous and important science.
Thank you.
If I may, we spent a fair amount of time trying to describe and explain the latest scientific findings in a way that the typical person would be able to appreciate. But we don't do that for every single publication. You know, I mean, people all through the day have been showing you how many publications there are. We're drowning in publications. But certainly for key studies, a fair amount of time and effort goes into doing this in each institute and center. And then, just in terms of diseases and conditions, every institute puts a fair amount of effort into a website that explains things not only for the professional, but also for patients and their advocates. So, so there is some effort in doing this, but it's certainly not for every single thing. So it's fair that there's a gap.
I think along the same line, the agencies have been emphasizing this for a very long time, understanding before many of us did that the importance of communicating to the public. And in my own personal experience has been a lot with NSF and the Department of Energy. And NSF has required for 15 years us to write the lay person's version to describe the impact. It would be interesting for me to see if the NSF went back through their 15 years of us scientists trying to do that, to see how well we did or not.
Hi, I wanted to follow up on that. I love that idea of having to manipulate light and sound to motivate others. So that is a huge learning process, right, for all of our scientists to learn and understand. How do you incentivize that beyond just saying it's a nice, good thing for you to do and you have to because it's the broader impacts of your NSF? But how is it that we can actually infuse that value into the scientists that we have?
So I'll answer the question, but first let me say something controversial and then I'll get to the answer. We don't need everybody to do it.
Sure.
Like you and I know people who are just, we love them and they're better off in the lab 24 hours a day.
Yes, I totally agree with that.
Right. They don't sleep. We need them there, right? But we need more people who can build a bridge, right? So I think you're already seeing it. So let me give you an example. In the UK, where granted university funding is different, there is central funding that goes to all universities, and every 7 years there is an evaluation of every department. One of the things they've done, because they're having the same conversation, is you get extra points in your department's evaluation, if you have a peer-reviewed article that you can then demonstrate has had a public impact. So in my field in political science, if you've gone and testified, if a nonprofit used it or something like that, you get like double points, basically. So the nice thing is AAAS actually has now, not only has awards for public engagement, which I think are great because promotion and tenure committees recognize awards from AAAS. They also have a thing which is really fabulous called the Leshner Leadership Institute. The Leshner Leadership Institute brings in, 15, 20 young scholars every year. And it's not just communication training, it's communication training and community building. So the idea is not just to build this one at a time, but to sort of give lots of people enthusiasm for this. So these are agencies that are, again, you want to make it an aspirational good. Now here's the other thing, and I say this with love to everyone, but mostly the younger people. A lot of younger people are figuring this out, right? I mean, sometimes we only see the negative side of Twitter. There are young academics using Twitter in really creative ways to convey their research to audiences they would have never had in any previous generation. Twitter's not the only medium, but the point is, you can, the youngins who are more familiar with this technology, who are trying to find their way in this complicated world, are actually just every day inventing new ways to get the science out. So some of it's coming from above, but from my point of view, it's great that some of it's also coming from the ground.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else? Well, I think this has been a good segue to the next panel, which is going to focus on communicating to the public with experts who are engaged in the press and are taking the other side, I think, of the seat from our side. And so we will have now a 15-minute break. In 15 minutes, we'll be back for that last panel. And I do hope that you will be joining us for the reception when we can kind of debrief and talk a little bit about what are some of the things that can be done for the Philadelphia region going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice to meet you.